All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Have you ever wanted to just completely hit the reset button on your entire life? Like literally start over from scratch? Well, today we are looking at a guy who did exactly that. And he did it after a decade of orchestrating some of the most decadent, self-destructive parties in New York City. We're exploring the absolutely incredible transformation of Scott Harrison. It's a wild journey that asks some pretty fundamental questions about the human conscience. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this, because to really understand the transformation, you've got to understand the absolute toxicity of where it started. We're dropping straight into the blinding lights and intense sensory overload of New York City nightlife right around the fall of 2003. Scott Harrison is 28 years old, and he isn't just showing up to the hottest parties in Manhattan, he is literally the architect of them. For 10 years, he's clawed his way up to become one of the top club promoters in the city. His actual literal job description revolves around getting wasted, spraying insanely expensive champagne, and surrounding himself with the most elite tier of fashion models and Wall Street bankers. But beneath all those strobe lights, a really horrifying physical reality is just beginning to set in. Scott was facing this terrifying medical mystery. Completely out of nowhere, the nerve endings in his arms and legs would just inexplicably die for 20 to 30 minutes at a time. He described it as this prickly blanket of numbness spreading from his fingers all the way up to his wrists. It got so bad, he felt like he could take a hammer, smash his hand, and literally not feel a thing. I mean, imagine how scary that is. He goes through this massive battery of hospital tests, MRIs, CT scans, blood work, electrical monitoring of his muscles. The doctors were hunting for tumors, blood clots, literally anything to explain this creeping paralysis. But guess what? Every single test came back completely normal. The doctors were totally baffled. He was just inexplicably going numb. The answers to that crazy medical mystery and his entire dramatic origin story are laid bare in his memoir, Thirst. And throughout this explainer, we are basically mapping out his exact trajectory, from extreme moral bankruptcy to this really desperate search for redemption. We're going to look at the exact variables that drove him to the edge, starting with the sheer scale of the excess that defined his daily existence. Just to put his lifestyle into perspective for a second, at his absolute peak, Scott was pulling in around 200 grand a year, but he was living like a millionaire, mostly thanks to massive brand sponsorships. Brands like Bacardi and Budweiser were paying him $2 grand a month each just to be seen holding their drinks in public. He lived in this massive industrial midtown loft with a baby grand piano. On his wrist, a Rolex Oyster Perpetual, gifted to him by his girlfriend who just happened to be a 19-year-old Vogue model. And to keep this relentless, chaotic circus running, he was surviving on a wildly dangerous diet. We're talking 2 to 3 packs of Marlboro Reds a day, up to 10 drinks a night, and cocaine 2 to 3 times a week, followed by Ambien just to force himself to come down. But here's the thing. Scott wasn't always this king of excess. Let's shift gears and see how this builds, because to really understand this reckless sprint into adulthood, we have to rewind to his childhood in suburban New Jersey. Back in 1980, when Scott was just 4 years old, his mother unexpectedly collapsed. For an entire year, doctors had no clue why she was constantly plagued by severe nausea and extreme fatigue. Finally, a plumber pulls back the casing of their gas furnace and finds pinholes in the heat exchanger. For a whole year, their tightly sealed home had been slowly filling up with an invisible, odorless poison, carbon monoxide. Now, what's really fascinating about this is the actual medical data. A carboxyhemoglobin test revealed a truly staggering truth. The saturation level in his mom's blood was 25%. To give you some context on that, anything over 2% in a non-smoker indicates poisoning, and once you get over 24%, you're risking immediate cardiac arrest. She was barely alive, but even after they replaced the furnace and totally gutted the house, her immune system was just utterly destroyed. Her body became kind of like an overflowing rain barrel. She developed this severe, debilitating environmental illness where practically every chemical, food, or everyday odor became a highly toxic trigger. And this trauma forced the Harrison family into a really extreme quarantine lifestyle. Scott's mother had to completely isolate herself in a sterile bedroom. Any visitors who wanted to see her had to go through this absurdly strict, multi-step decontamination process using just baking soda and ivory soap. Eventually, even those precautions failed and visitors were just banished entirely. So Scott's world shrank dramatically. He essentially became the primary caretaker. He was washing floors with basic biodegradable cleaners, doing the laundry, and living in this constant state of hypervigilance just to protect his mom from invisible chemical attackers. Talk about claustrophobia, right? The contrast between his past and his future is just almost unbelievable when you lay it out. Childhood Scott was this dutiful foot soldier, right? He was microwaving unseasoned cod for 6 minutes for his sick mother and playing piano for his church. He was deeply embedded in a household where honesty, respect, and obedience were pretty much sacred bylaws. But the claustrophobia definitely took its toll. Adult Scott completely rejected those strict boundaries. He totally flipped the script, trading in that wholesome service for snorting cocaine, popping champagne, and absolutely ruling the New York City nightclub scene. So, how did that pivot actually happen? Well, it began in his teenage years. Scott had been attending this tiny Christian school in a church basement where the teachers were, and I'm not kidding, literally just VHS tapes rolled in on metal carts. Desperate for any kind of freedom, he rebels, finally forcing his parents to let him attend a massive public high school. And there, this skinny nerd in LL Bean khakis somehow manages to talk his way into an alt-rock band called Sunday River. They were older, they swore, they partied, and Scott, who was actually still a sober kid at the time, became their manager and keyboardist, hustling to book them gigs all across the Northeast. By 19, he's totally done with any plans for a conservative Christian college. He takes his college fund and flees to a $650 a month walk-up in New York City's West Village. And man, he was incredibly naive. Literally on his very first morning, a street hustler scams him out of $150 for a video camera box that, wait for it, turned out to just hold a gray rock wrapped in newspaper. Welcome to New York, right? But the city quickly got its hooks into him. Someone brought him to Club USA, which was this notorious Times Square hotspot. Seeing those laser lights, the fog, the models dancing on pedestals, and sliding down their infamous plexiglass chute straight into the pulsing dance floor, it was this overwhelming sensory taste of a world he realized he never, ever wanted to leave. So the crucial point here is that Scott didn't just adapt to this wild environment. He totally conquered it. After learning the ropes at a club called Nell's, he climbed to the very top of NYC nightlife as an image promoter for Lotus. This was a hyper-exclusive supper club in the meatpacking district. His job wasn't just to pack the room, it was to curate the ultimate VIP experience. He vetted the wealthy, making sure hedge fund guys could only get in if they were deemed cool enough to sit near the fashion designers, A-list actors, and supermodels he brought in. He basically became the gatekeeper to the ultimate New York fantasy. And the decadence of his peak club days, absolutely staggering. The entire business model ran on this concept of models and bottles. Scott's main objective was to convince rich bankers to drop $600 on a single bottle of champagne, a bottle they could easily buy down the street for a tenth of the price. But they did it just for the privilege of drinking it near supermodels. And for his efforts, Scott and his business partner took home a massive cut of the bar sales and door cash. It was incredibly lucrative, for sure, but it required pushing the party further and further into excess every single night. But of course, that level of excess has a terrifying dark side. In June 2001, Scott experienced the absolute horrifying pit of his nightlife career. His business partner, Brantley, accidentally snorted heroin thinking it was cocaine while they were at a club called Halo. Minutes later, bouncers are dragging Brantley's limp, convulsing body into the harsh fluorescent lights of the club's kitchen. His lips were turning blue. As the club owner is frantically performing CPR on the cold cement floor, Scott genuinely thought his best friend was going to die right there. Miraculously, Brantley was revived. But you know what the truly terrifying part is? The trauma of that night barely slowed them down. The toxic cycle just kept right on spinning. Let's fast forward to the winter of 2003. Scott is completely burnt out. His body is literally going numb like we talked about, and he desperately needs a break. So he and his friends rent this breathtaking 7-bedroom coastal compound down in Punta del Este, Uruguay for New Year's. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway to just, clear his head. Instead, it devolves into another raging, endless Lotus-style party. They blew $1,000 on fireworks, emptied magnums of Dom Perignon, and by 10 a.m. the next morning, dozens of people are popping ecstasy and dancing around the pool. Scott realized with a sinking dread that he had just flown thousands of miles only to recreate the exact prison he was trying to escape, just an endless, totally exhausting pool party. And this brilliantly illustrates the turning point. Exhausted and feeling completely spiritually bankrupt, Scott retreats from the endless pool party early one morning. He pulls out a book his father had given him for Christmas, a book called The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer. Sitting there quietly, he reads a passage that strikes him like a lightning bolt. Where faith is defective, the result will be numbness. And suddenly, it all just made sense. The numbness in his arms and legs, it wasn't a physical disease the doctors had missed. It was a symptom of spiritual death. His conscience had been completely seared by a decade of total toxicity. This massive epiphany sparked a really desperate hunger inside of him. He finally realized that pursuing all this material wealth, the status, the constant pleasure, it had left him entirely empty.
He didn't want to be the guy who curated vanity and enabled destruction anymore. He wanted to escape the toxicity and seek a totally new kind of purity. Not one defined by his mother's ivory soap and baking soda, but by real moral clarity. Returning to New York, he starts pacing his loft, quietly listening to sermons on his iPod. He starts stepping away from the drugs and the VIP rooms, desperately asking for a way out of the life-flight casino he built for himself.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. When you finally wake up from a decade of absolute self-inflicted numbness, what do you do next? How do you re-enter the real world when your only marketable skills are getting people wasted and spotting fake designer shoes? Well, Scott Harrison was about to find out, setting the perfect stage for a mission that would eventually bring clean water to millions. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, sometimes hitting absolute rock bottom is the only way to find out what you're really thirsting for. Catch you next time.